America lifted petrol rationing within 24 hours of the end of World War II. As the nation celebrated, few worried where the oil would come from or who would control it. The country turned to the pleasures and the prosperity of peace.
Soon you'll be able to give that jalopy a well-earned rest. With gas again plentiful, and with new cars and new tires on the way, America will be rolling with a pre-war flourish. Yes, cars, radios, vacuum cleaners, nylons, juicy steaks. It sounds almost like a dream.
If you learn enough about the oil industry, you begin to understand that the economics of oil mean if there is a surplus of oil produced in the world, the price of oil can go to zero. That nightmare drove a generation and more of American petroleum executives. How do we prevent the price of oil from dropping to the point where literally oil is worth nothing?
The war had taught governments that oil was a business too important to be left to businessmen.
Oil had been a big business, a global business right from the beginning. But the Second World War demonstrated more than ever before that oil was also a key part of grand strategy, essential to the power and the position of nations. Oil was more political than ever before. This increased the anxiety about where oil supplies would come from, how would they get to market, would there be enough, would they be safe? And all of that stood in marked contrast to the situation in the 1930s before the Second World War, when the issue was too much oil and what to do about it.
Oil is like a gigantic plumbing system. When there's too much at any given place, and there's no place to put it, you have a flood. Now, this in fact happened in the United States in the 1930s, when oil fields were discovered in Texas, and there was no market for the oil, and the oil literally spilled on fields and ruined crops, and the price of oil went to zero. It was that fact, that central economic fact, that led to a variety of agreements between and among the major companies to coordinate the question of supply and demand so that there would never be the kind of surplus that would drive the price down in that horrifying way, horrifying to the company's way.
The international agreements in the early 1930s to stabilize the price of oil didn't work very well. The major companies didn't trust each other, and they and the smaller companies were trying constantly to take markets away from each other. Moreover, even in those glut years of the Great Depression, the name of the game was still oil in the ground.
In the early 1930s, the faint possibility of oil had brought a little attention to a part of the world traditionally left to adventurers and writers, and in particular to an obscure desert kingdom and its warrior king. Saudi Arabia, a land of Bedouin and pilgrims, of sand and camels, 3 times the size of Texas, had been created by one man, Abdul Aziz bin Abdul Rahman bin Faisal al Saud, known to the West as Ibn Saud. He had welded the warring tribes of the Arabian Peninsula into the kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
If you were thinking of who would play him in a movie, you would have a bit of Errol Flynn and a bit of Zorba the Greek and a bit of Sean Connery. Very tall, handsome, dynamic, who in the early years of this century, from 1900 to 1925, 26, was literally riding round Arabia on the back of a camel with a scimitar and musket, conquering oases, marrying desert princesses, adding bit by bit to this enormous empire, which by the middle of the 1920s was larger than Western Europe.
At the age of 20, Ibn Saud was ready. But the capture of Riyadh was but a dream beyond belief.
Amin,
The king loved telling his stories, and I very often heard them at dinner about how he and a few friends had taken Riyadh, how various other things had happened, and they always grew a little bit with the telling, but they were always fun.
What he'd already done in his country was to develop a network of relationship with all the various tribes by marrying the daughter of a tribal head, and then after some period of time, since he had 4 wives, divorced that one, set her up pretty well financially, and then have a couple of sons, and then marry somebody else. The result was he developed a whole network of personal relationships throughout the country.
Ibn Saud financed his kingdom with the money he made from the Muslim pilgrims visiting the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. However, in the Depression of the 1930s, the numbers had fallen drastically, and so had the king's revenue. Standard Oil of California, based in San Francisco, had found a little oil on an island in the Persian Gulf. Sokal hoped that it might find more. The man who was going to help Sokal in its quest was living in Saudi Arabia. He was an explorer, an Arabist, a businessman, and an advisor of sorts to the king. The name Philby is nowadays tied to the infamy of Kim Philby, the Soviet master spy, but his father, Harry St. John Bridger Philby, or just plain Jack, had his place in history too. On a car ride with the king, Jack Philby suggested that beneath the kingdom's sands there might be buried treasure. Oil. The beleaguered monarch listened. Back in California, Sokal retained Philby, though most experts said there was no oil in Arabia, to get an oil concession. But would the king grant the concession?
When he was first asked what he knew about America, he was under the impression that it was inhabited by Red Indians. It was miles away for him, and in a way he preferred dealing with the Americans, because it's one of the rules of Bedouin warfare that you, wherever possible, try to create allies as far away from you as possible, because they're the ones who are going to give you the least trouble. The British were on the spot. They had their steamers going through the Red Sea, stopping in Jeddah. They were always meddling. So I suppose, in principle, he rather preferred the idea of dealing with this distant power, who also, by the time they appeared, seemed to have so much more money than the British as well.
The oil company's main negotiator was a lawyer, Lloyd Hamilton. The king's, his finance minister, Abdullah Suleiman. The year was 1933. Everything depended on Jack Philby.
We don't exactly know on whose side Philby was. I mean, he was partly on Sokal's side. He was also obviously on his friend Abdelaziz's side, because at the same time as representing Sokal, he told British oil companies about the fact that Abdelaziz was looking for someone. He was looking for money. He somehow managed to entice to Jeddah, not just representatives of Sokal, but representatives of British oil as well, and then played this wonderful game with the rival bidders there in Jeddah.
A deal was struck for what seemed at the time like a steep price, $275,000. The king, you see, thought he'd sold the Americans sand.
I tell you, being in Saudi Arabia and going down to the Gulf a number of times, I could feel very strongly that the British really resented us even getting into the Gulf. They really did resent us. They didn't like us even coming into places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And they really made it very clear that this was our area of influence.
Well, I think there was a British regret that they had not taken the opportunity in the 30s to get that oil concession, and they could have gotten it had they shown an interest. Whether there was a really serious British intent, either governmental intent or on the part of any British company, to push out to the Americans I think this was an exaggerated American concern, but it was certainly a very real one in the minds of oil company people and some government people.
The Americans wasted no time. Their first geologists arrived on a dhow.
Yeah, that could be quite a dome. Take a look, Al. Thanks.
There's an amusing story about an American geologist. He got off the airplane, and they met him, and they said, well, we'll take you to your room, and we'll set you up with your research apparatus. How long do you think it will take you to get ready to begin your work? Research, hell, he said, drill there. And he pointed to a big dome. Drill there, he said. And he turned over the Persian Gulf and saw the Dahran Dome in Saudi Arabia. And he said, and also drill there.
On the 1st of December, 1937, Tom Barger set off for Arabia to look for oil. He would stay for 32 years and become chairman of the largest oil production company in the world. But on that Tuesday in New York, all he could think of was that he was leaving behind his bride of 2 weeks.
December 15th, 1937. Dearest Kathleen, we landed at Bahrain Island day before yesterday. I came over in a native boat with a crew of 4 and a wonderfully patched gas engine assisted by a sail. Everyone in the camp is American. No British are allowed on the mainland. January 31st, 1938. Tomorrow we go into the desert again. We'll strike off to the southeast into Virgin Territory. No Europeans have ever been there, so instead of being 3rd or 4th, we'll be 1st. From a geological standpoint, it should be interesting. For the country is so remote, we have no idea what we shall find. May 5th, 1938. The weather was hotter than hell. I don't know how the Arabs can walk barefoot in the sand. The sand is uncomfortably hot on the hands when digging out the wheels. The metal parts of the car are too hot to push on without putting a handkerchief around your hands. Dear Cass, the days are very long without you, Cass. I would give a great deal for just one long look at your brown eyes. Somewhere I read a line, I shall love you until the sands of the desert grow cold. Don't believe it. I shall love you much longer than that. February 19th, 1938. I don't have much news on the chances of getting you here, as it all depends on the oil wells in Arabia. So pray for success.
Tom Barger was fascinated by everything he saw. He soon learned to speak Arabic, and he learned how to deal with royalty.
The king was at El Kharj at the time. He had sort of a summer home there, and Tom Barger had a globe of the world with the countries and continents on it, and showed where Saudi Arabia was, where the United States was, and what have you. At that time, there was a lot of publicity in the news about Mars. They'd discovered something new about Mars. The king, he was very interested in Mars. He was very inquisitive. And he said, I'll bet there's life on Mars, and they'll get up there someday and they'll find out. And he says, you know, the first thing they'll find, they're going to be American geologists up there poring over the desert looking for oil.
company is going in for Arabia in a big way. They've started building duplexes, and new men are coming in all the time. Orders from San Francisco are that drilling is to take precedence over everything else.
Finally, after almost 5 years of disappointment and discouragement, well number 7 struck oil. The Arabian-American oil company, Aramco, was on its way. By coincidence, Queen Victoria's granddaughter was visiting Ibn Saud at that moment. The Countess of Athlone sent a message back to England. "I think the Americans have stolen a march on us," she said. She was right.
Dear Cass, yesterday well number 7 blew in with a roar. Everyone is very optimistic. The more oil we find, the more people will come, and the sooner I'll have you here with me.
March 1938 is a momentous month in the history of the petroleum industry. In Mexico, the government successfully expropriates the U.S. and British companies, thereby ending an era in oil development. An era of unabashed exploitation comes to an end as the companies understand that there are limits, and that if the government pushes past that limit, the companies will be punished. Meanwhile, halfway across the world in the same month, almost the same day, the Standard Oil of California is discovering the first producing well in Saudi Arabia. The first event, the Mexican expropriation, ends the early era of oil. The second event, the discovery of producing wells in Saudi Arabia, introduces the new era, that is, the coming of the Middle East as the major source of production.
That first oil shipment was a royal event.
It was May 1st. It was a nice hot day, lots of sun, and of course, practically all the Aramco people were there. The king had brought a huge group of people across the desert. We had cars, we had tractors out pulling them out of the sand and what have you. But he had a small army almost with him. And at the conclusion of it, the old King Ibn Saud, who's a big man, should have been a college fullback on somebody's football team, and he got out with a huge long sword and danced the sword dance there in the sand for all the people gathered around and what have you.
There were no diplomats present. They would come later. It was left to oilmen and Bedouin, executives and emirs to watch the monarch turn on the tap that would send the first Saudi oil to the world and bring America closer to his kingdom. It was, however, 1939, the year the Second World War began.
September 14th, 1939. All is quiet here as befits a neutral country. About the only real worry is the remote possibility that the well will be sabotaged. The country is so sparsely populated that everyone knows everyone else. A stranger would have a very tough time wiggling in.
Suspicion was ripe. When a British team of entomologists arrived, the Americans were convinced there were some British oilmen amongst them, disguised as bug hunters.
The United States had been relying on the British to maintain stability in the Middle East and maintain an environment in which private oil companies could operate. And the British were there. The British had close relations with many of the governments. And they were afraid that perhaps the British might use their political connections with the King of Saudi Arabia to push the American company out and get a British company in.
I don't think there's any doubt that if the British had really wanted the oil of Saudi Arabia, they could have got it. Right at the last minute, when Ibn Saud knew that the Americans had offered, I think, 5 times as much as the British, he went to the British ambassador, Ryan, and said, well, look, this is the offer. Shall I take it? And if Ryan had said, no, you're on our side, you're our sphere of influence, despite the money, he would have gone with the British. But Ryan didn't. Ryan said, take the Americans' money. There's no oil there. Thus is history made.
A favorite question
gasoline rationing. To me, rationing of anything runs against the grain.
As the petroleum requirements of the World War mounted, Washington became gripped by an acute fear of an oil shortage. The security and availability of Saudi oil took on urgent significance.
From the point of view of the American government, 1943 was the turning point, because in the middle of World War II, the government, the State Department, the military, the petroleum people all began to realize that oil was extremely important from a military strategic point of view. Secondly, the United States did not have adequate reserves over the long haul. And the third thing was that Aramco had a concession to Saudi Arabia. So the issue was, how do we deal with that? Well, one party, namely Harold Ickes, wanted to buy a government interest in Aramco. The majors who were not involved with Aramco himself said, stop, don't do that. So he quit. Next thing he tried to do was to build a pipeline at government expense. This time, it raised the fears of the Texas independents about being flooded with cheap Saudi oil. And a big furor arose to the point where even Texas school children sent letters into the president complaining about what Ickes was doing. From then on, it was a matter of encouraging the oil companies to help production grow in Saudi Arabia, but the government would stay out of it from that point on.
Ickes sent Everett de Golyer, America's leading geologist, to Saudi Arabia to assess the potential of the new oil discoveries. De Golyer declared that the Middle East would become oil's new center of gravity. One member of his team went further. He said, "The oil in this region is the single greatest prize in all history."
Everyone knew that there was something big out in the Middle East, but no one knew quite how big. His report, as an expert, gave the greatest impetus to interest in the Middle East, because everyone could see that this was the real jackpot of world oil. This was the biggest pot anywhere in the world.
On his way back from the Yalta Conference, President Roosevelt arranged to meet the desert ruler on board an American cruiser to establish a new relationship between their two countries. The king did not want to sleep in a cabin. Instead, he slept on deck in a tent.
Roosevelt had heard a great deal about Ibn Saud from oil company people, from Harold Ickes, the former Secretary of Interior. Remember that during the war years, government, in the person of Ickes, tried to buy out the Aramco concession, so there was interest in it. The Navy was interested. Roosevelt, you must remember, was an ex-Navy man. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So coming back, it was urged on him that he meet with Ibn Saud.
At that meeting, oil and Israel are introduced and discussed together for the first time. The King of Saudi Arabia has an interesting response to Roosevelt when Roosevelt introduces the idea of creating a state of Israel in Palestine. The King says instead that it would be more just to create that state in Germany after the war.
Furious at this new relationship, Churchill hastily arranged a meeting with Ibn Saud for himself. Roosevelt, as a gift, had given the Arab king his spare wheelchair and an airliner, a DC-3.
Churchill, by comparison, had arrived rather patronizingly with a box of perfume from Asprey, which he was going to give to this Oriental potentate. He had rather a panic when he discovered that his rival, Roosevelt, had given the man a DC-3, so he cobbled together a story that the moment the Rolls-Royce works reopened in Derby, he would arrange for the very first limousine off the line to be given to Ibn Saud. The British went to enormous pains with their Rolls-Royce to Arabianize it. What they failed to work out was that in Arabia, kings and potentates do not sit in the back of limousines. So when the Rolls-Royce finally arrived in Riyadh, the king strode out to see it, sat in the front, and promptly got out again because the British had failed to switch the steering wheel, with the result that the chauffeur was sitting on the right, and it meant that Ibn Saud would have to sit on the left in the place of dishonor. So he got out, slammed the door, and gave it to his younger brother. He never drove in it again.
Churchill sought to preserve British influence in the Middle East, but the times were against him. In Iran, British efforts had developed a vast oil industry. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was half owned by the British government.
It was the biggest single foreign asset of Britain, and that was saying something at that time. And there is no doubt that the Americans were extremely envious of the very strong position which the British held in Iran, and would not have been too sorry to see us weakened in some way.
Iran was a major oil-producing country long before Saudi Arabia, but Anglo-Iranian had also become the #1 target of Iranian nationalists.
The British are unable to bring themselves to see that in the post-war world, nation-states within what is now the Third World will demand sovereign independence that may involve sovereign state control over their own economic resources. The Americans are much clearer that European colonialism is finished, that although it's not going to disappear overnight, that there is a need to at least pay formal recognition to notions of national self-determination. And that requires a more sensitive handling of issues than a simple blank refusal, which was the British policy.
After the war, the Iranians were no longer content to let the foreigners make more from the oil than they were making themselves. There was a fierce movement to get the British out. In 1951, the Iranians nationalized their oil. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson said, "Never had so few lost so much, so stupidly and so fast."
Well, I don't want to deprecate others. We had the advantage of never having had a colonial empire. And so we didn't know how to act in a colonial way. Our people, I think, were more friendly and natural in their dealings with the local people.
One of the things that may be interesting to you all, that we worked for 5 kings in Saudi Arabia. First, of course, was King Abdulaziz, and then he died, of course, in '53, and then we had King Saud, and then we had King Faisal, and then we had King Khalid, and of course then we had King Fahd. So
the only kings of Saudi Arabia ever had.
5 kings. That's really something else.
We worked under all 5 kings of Saudi Arabia. We outlasted them by
all time.
Ibn Saud came to Ras Tanur in 1947. I was just a young 22-year-old. I thought, royalty, hell, that doesn't mean a thing. I will admit, that man walked very slowly, very regally, and he changed my mind just like that.
Nomadic kings?
Oh, he was 6'4" tall and stately and very slow moving.
200 kids.
But
you'd be slow moving too.
But I all of a sudden got respect for royalty. Saud, the second, his son, he was not that good. He in fact went to Egypt and tried to. In fact, he was deposed, wasn't he?
Yeah. You don't ever intend to go back to Saudi Arabia.
2010.
In the early years of the oilmen coming to Saudi Arabia, alcohol was not in fact a problem. There was no law prohibiting it. Then there was an incident when a British diplomat, a man called Cyril Ousmane, supplied drink for a party. A Saudi prince got drunk, lost his temper, got a gun from somewhere, and shot Ousmane dead. Ousmane's grave can still be seen in Jeddah, and it's said that local expatriates go and spit on it regularly, because as a result of the incident, Ibn Saud decreed that all alcohol would henceforward be banned from the kingdom.
We used to mix frozen orange juice, sugar, yeast, and water, and you let it ferment for 3 or 4 days. It was still working, and you'd drink a whole glass full of that down, or 3 or 4, You'd wake up the next morning and later that night, your head would be just pounding. But you'd always say to your host, that was the best batch you ever made yet. We didn't learn that you had to let it ferment up because it's still fermenting inside you.
We made an agreement with Ibn Saud that we would give him gold. For every ton of oil we took out of his country, we would give them gold. And we did at first. And then we got producing more and more and more and tried to find gold shillings to meet the requirements so we could ship another ton. And finally, we had to tell him that we couldn't find that much gold. There wasn't that much gold. We had now such an enormous business that we cleaned the world of gold shillings.
Aramco was a unique company and did a lot of different things. For example, they knew that Islamic law was very strict. They knew that American oil men weren't necessarily as strict. And therefore, if there was a hint of violating Islamic law, or misbehaving in some way, the individual was whisked out of the country to Bahrain and flown back to the United States to get him out of the way before any issue arose.
We had one particularly capable, in fact, the top carpenter we had in the field practically, who had been a pastor originally in the United States and was sort of a missionary. And we learned that he was gathering some of these Arab youngsters together in the evening and telling them the story of Jesus Christ and so forth. We fired him on the spot and sent him back to the United States.
You remember one time we had a ban on bikinis in Dhahran? Well, it lasted only a short time.
We had. Well, yeah, but you guys started talking a lot about the bikinis, you know. But in the very early days, because they didn't have too much to wear with, but they held a beauty contest out there one time and nobody won the thing.
For a long period of time, the oil men were the self-made types who grew up with the industry. The second generation, which was the generation that came into its own in the 40s and the 50s, was a generation of people who had engineering backgrounds, who were trained as geologists and thought in that way. They were not trained in foreign policy. They didn't think in terms of the subtleties of foreign policy. Their job was to find the stuff, produce the stuff, and make money doing it. This put people who really were relatively unsophisticated in international affairs on the front line, doing the dealing in some extraordinarily sensitive areas of the world.
Alarmed at the rapid expansion of totalitarian interests in Europe and Asia, President Truman addresses a joint session of Congress on our changing foreign policy.
The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
I was a young second lieutenant in the Marine Corps during 47, 48, and the Navy was sending demolition teams out to the Gulf. It was like a Hollywood script. We were supposed to, in the event of an invasion by the Russians, we were supposed to go into Bahrain and into Saudi Arabia and just make sure that none of these oil wells fell into the Russian hands.
The need to rebuild a devastated Europe and contain communism gave birth to a massive American aid program, the Marshall Plan. Here, too, Arabian oil played its part.
the oil companies can deliver increased oil production. And in fact, the oil companies become vehicles of the national interest in foreign oil. Now, this national interest is not oil from the Middle East for the United States. It's oil from the Middle East for Western Europe, for economic recovery. It's oil from the Middle East for Japan for economic recovery. Now, economic recovery is, in turn, is seen as crucial to stability, to democracy, and to the containment of communism in Western Europe and in Asia.
A new relationship was surely emerging between the United States and Saudi Arabia. A full-scale official visit was arranged for the Crown Prince.
There was a clear policy within the government that development of Middle Eastern oil rapidly was a good idea because it would conserve resources in the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, anything we could do to support the companies and Saudi Arabia for producing oil, for selling it worldwide was a good idea.
Access to oil was critical to the West in the Cold War. Oil was vital to Saudi economic development, and the American relationship was vital to Saudi security.
There was one critical point that always came through, and that was the king's belief that Saudi Arabia was encircled. The British, that is in the Trucial States, were encirclers. The Hashemites in Iraq were encirclers. The Egyptians were encirclers. The Jordanians were encirclers. And there was encirclement. Therefore, he needed help, and the United States he was turning to.
From all accounts, the Saudi Arabian encounter with the American dream was a big success. But like royalty around the world, the Saudi royal family did not carry cash.
It seemed that all of the members of the party would enjoy going shopping, but they never had any money in their pocket. They would send the items they purchased to me at the hotel, COD. That meant that I carried a minimum of 4 $1,000 bills in my pocket at all times. And that was in 1947 when $1,000 was $1,000.
Until the end of the 1940s, the United States and Latin America provided the bulk of Europe's oil. And then the Middle East took over, fueling these economic miracles in Western Europe and then in Japan. Really, two key things were happening. The rest of the world was following the American example, shifting from coal to oil. And at the same time, economic growth meant rapidly rising consumption of oil in factories and power plants, in automobiles. So the world was going to need a lot more Saudi oil, much more than the two Aramco partners, SoCal and Texaco, could provide. And the investment requirements they faced would be staggering.
So in the Great Oil Deal of 1947, Aramco was expanded to include two bigger and richer partners. Aramco's original partners, SoCal and Texaco, were joined by Esso and Saccone Vacuum, later to become Exxon and Mobil. SoCal is today's Chevron. 2 years earlier, one U.S. government official had said he did not care which American company or companies developed the Arabian reserves, just so long as they were American.
The American government's position clearly was to stay out of the oil business, but to reinforce things the companies did. It worked out very nicely that way. So frequently when the companies would come in and ask for an okay on a particular policy, the official response was no objection. That was the code word for the fact that we support you. So the code word was no objection.
The relationship was about to be tested by the establishment of the State of Israel.
On the one hand, the governments and the companies are trying to secure access to oil. On the other, they're trying to come to a solution to deal with the very tricky question of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. The fear, of course, is that the rulers of the Middle Eastern oil-producing nations will not be able to live with the creation of Israel.
While maintaining a formal hostility to Zionism, King Ibn Saud, pragmatic as ever, resigned himself to the existence of the new State of Israel. The oil companies could carry on as they were.
It really puts the American government in an awkward position and leads to, more reinforces the division of labor between the American government and the oil companies. The oil companies take responsibility for oil and almost for relations with Saudi Arabia. Aramco is almost the diplomatic department of the U.S. government that deals with Saudi Arabia, whereas the U.S. government has to take responsibility for its actions vis-a-vis Israel.
In large measure, the company's dealings with the State Department were in secret, were classified by the State Department, and certainly no one in the popular press or even in the academic world had more than a hint of the degree to which there had been dealings back and forth between the companies and the government.
Later, the Church Committee heard how concern for the Western oil position in the Middle East led Washington to promote a new kind of deal. A 50-50 split in profits between the companies and the oil countries. It was first offered to Venezuela during the war. Now even Saud wanted it too. Assistant Secretary of State George McGee urged the reluctant companies to roll with the punch and face the practical necessity for horse trading with the Saudis.
Actually, Ibn Saud had a Minister of Finance who was a very determined man, and he was putting pressure on our companies and giving them the impression that they might actually take the concession away from Aramco. And we took very seriously the job of trying to help Aramco keep that concession.
The solution was to allow the companies to use an old U.S. law, the foreign tax credit law, to change the way that they paid money to Saudi Arabia. This allowed the companies to pay much higher taxes in exchange for reducing their taxes in the United States, thus allowing money to flow to Saudi Arabia outside of the formal congressional approval, foreign aid budgets, and the like.
The companies don't have to pay more. The Saudi Arabian government gets the money that previously had gone to the United States. And the U.S. government probably saw it as a price it was willing to pay for stability in the region.
In Iran, Anglo-Iranian regarded the 50-50 concept as a threat to its position. It stubbornly refused to adjust to the new realities. By the time Anglo-Iranian was ready to go along, it was too late. All its assets in Iran, oil fields, pipelines, and the world's largest refinery were nationalized, and the British were booted out.
I think that in the early stages of the trouble between the British and the Persians, the Americans were not too unhappy at seeing us having difficulties. But once the thing got to the floodwaters breaking through, they began to lose their nerve and realized the impact of such happenings on their own oil concessions in other countries.
The young pro-Western Shah was little more than a figurehead. Real power lay with the elderly aristocrat, Prime Minister Mossadegh, whose eccentricities included negotiating from his bed in pajamas.
Mossadegh established a state-owned company to take control of Anglo-Iranian's assets. There were repeated attempts to work out a settlement, but they all failed. Mossadegh was an ardent nationalist, and he was implacably anti-British. There were also, however, political calculations at work. He told some Americans that he couldn't take the risk of making a deal with the British because it would destroy his political position at home. So Mossadegh had his victory. The British were out, and he controlled Iran's oil. There was just one problem. When he went to the world market, he found that he couldn't sell any of the oil.
The companies put a worldwide boycott on Iranian oil, and in particular, Anglo-Persian Oil Company said, that's our oil, wherever a cargo of it turns up, we are going to seize it.
As the situation deteriorated, the new Eisenhower administration feared Mossadegh would lead his country into the Soviet camp.
I went to Washington with the permission of Anthony Eden, and I put it to the Americans that there was a very serious communist threat against Iran. The Americans were not hard to convince. There was a general fear of communism in the early 1950s, which it was not hard to play on.
Eisenhower agreed to a joint CIA-MI6 operation codenamed Ajax to support the opposition movement in Iran and to topple Mossadegh. The operation took less than 2 months.
Mossadegh had perfected the technique of calling out the mobs on the street when he didn't get his own way, chiefly in order to frighten the Shah, and the Shah was very easily frightened. We were only able to defeat this tactic in the end by doing a bit of mob organizing of our own in support of the Shah.
Mossadegh fled. He was finished. The Shah was restored to his peacock throne. Embarrassed by his need for Western help, he was determined not to be a figurehead, but an absolute monarch. America had helped topple Mossadegh to contain communism. Britain to regain its oil interests.
It was a great tragedy. The net impact on the Iranian people was to make them very, very anti-American, more than anti-British, because we appeared to have had the major role in his overthrow. It's just like somebody had come here and overthrown George Washington, who was the father of our country. Many Iranians considered Mossadegh the father of their country.
Washington now had to deal with the fact that Iran had been out of the world oil market for 2 years.
The problem was this: how do you get Iranian production back without totally crashing the world price of oil? So the U.S. government goes to the companies and says, gentlemen, please begin lifting oil here in Iran. You've got to take this Iranian oil. And the proposal was the creation of a consortium of oil companies that would bring Iranian oil to market in a, quote, orderly fashion.
Many of the oil men claim that they were reluctantly brought into this affair by the U.S. State Department, that they really had no interest in entering Iran. Whatever their short-term motivations, however, it's clear that the Iranian Consortium, the creation of the Iranian Consortium in 1954, is the culmination of almost 30 years of effort by the major international oil companies to build a viable, controllable world order of oil.
The new consortium consisted of 8 major and 9 independent oil companies. Despite pressure from the U.S. government, the American majors were reluctant to be drawn into the unstable politics of Iran. They felt they had more than enough oil in Saudi Arabia. But what Washington and London wanted was for the consortium to stabilize Iran by handling the management of its increasing oil output.
Of course, when you start talking about regulating production, you run up against the United States antitrust laws. This is exactly what the companies are not supposed to do. And in fact, one of the obstacles to the consortium was an antitrust suit against the major oil companies by the United States Department of Justice. In the end, the government had to choose between national security and increased competition in world oil markets. And it came down on the side of security and stability in the Middle East and in oil markets over the uncertainties that could be created by increased competition.
In the post-war years, politics could not stay away from oil, and oil could not get away from politics. The industry was being shaped not only by the clash of the marketplace and oil's strategic significance for the world economy, but also by the global rivalries of the Cold War and by the fiery nationalisms of the Middle East.
If one wants to ask whether this system worked, then I think it's important to ask, who did it work for? The consequence of the coup in Iran was 20 years of cheap prices for the West, yes, but 20 years of military dictatorship for the Iranian people. So The question of does the system work, I think, depends on where one stands.
In economic terms, things were actually getting better for the oil-producing countries. Their revenues were rising rapidly as demand for oil increased around the world, and their economies were growing fast as well. But if you lived in one of those oil countries, the companies, the big Western companies, still looked imperial and impregnable, the masters of markets and technologies. But nationalism was rising, and as the Western world was growing more and more dependent upon oil, the balance of power was shifting from the companies to the countries, and the struggle was just beginning.
Next, on the prize, power to the producers. Cheap oil was making Americans happy and oil companies rich. Yet the countries that produced the oil were being left behind. What would happen next would change the world forever. Petroleum became political. The struggle to control it was only beginning. Based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Daniel Yergin, The Prize.